Every king has his biographer, every legend has its authorized version. The story we tell ourselves about Bumpy Johnson, the street genius, the Harlem Robin Hood. The criminal mastermind with a heart is a beautiful mosaic. But mosaics are made from broken pieces, carefully arranged to show a chosen picture. What if I told you the most dangerous adversary Bumpy Johnson ever faced wasn't Dutch Schultz, or Lucky Luciano, or the FBI, but a story, a narrative so powerful, so carefully constructed, that it began erasing the real man even before his heart stopped beating. And the architect of this narrative wasn't a rival gangster. It was the United States government. This is the story they buried. This is the file marked redacted. This is the counter history. The story of how Bumpy Johnson became the patron saint of a lie. Act 1. The problem a living legend. The early 1960s. Bumpy was an anomaly. A black man who had built an autonomous, economically powerful underworld empire that operated parallel to and often intertwined with the white establishment. He was a symbol to Harlem, a complex one part protector, part parasite to J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. He was an ideological nightmare. He wasn't just a criminal. He was proof of concept. Proof that a black organization could achieve self-sufficiency, political influence, and wealth outside the sanctioned paths of the crumbling civil rights movement. He was Malcolm X's economic separatism, armed and operational on the streets. This made him more dangerous than any radical speech. He was a working model. His imminent arrest on narcotics charges was a given. But putting him in prison wasn't enough. They needed to discredit the model, to turn the symbol from a flawed hero into a simple monster, to make sure no young man in Harlem ever looked at Bumpy Johnson's story and saw a blueprint. Act 2. The blueprint, Operation Narrativeaner. A man we'll call the architect, a senior agent in the Bureau's Racial Matters Division, a psychologist by training, a propagandist by vocation. His memo, declassified decades later, outlined the strategy with chilling clarity. Target, Ellsworth Johnson. Objective, not merely incarceration, but narrative annihilation. We must separate the man from the mythos of Harlem. We must recontextualize his criminality not as resistance or complex entrepreneurship, but as a predatory betrayal of his own community. We must make him a villain in the story of Black America's progress. The playbook had 3 acts. The hero creation diversion amplified the one part of the legend that served them. Bumpy is the black godfather who stood up to the Italian mob. This was a safe story. It was interracial conflict. It fit old narratives. It made him seem like an ethnic warlord, not an economic revolutionary. The Luciano sit-down became the only story. It was pumped into the media through reliable sources and true crime pulp magazines. The strategic omission, the erasure, systematically downplay or erase everything. That complicated the villain narrative. His patronage of black artists during the Renaissance, his complex, adversarial, but real relationship with the Harlem community where he was often a lender of last resort, a disputer of evictions, his intellectualism. His role as a de facto, if corrupt political power broker who actually delivered tangible, if cynical, benefits. All this was scrubbed from the emerging public record. The poison pill, the big lie, introduce and amplify the most damaging association possible, heroin. Leak investigative findings to cooperative reporters linking Bumpy directly to the scourge, ravaging Harlem. Never mind that his actual power base was numbers and labor racketeering. Never mind that the real heroin pipelines were controlled by the Corsicans and the LCN, with whom Bumpy had a hands-off understanding. The narrative became, Bumpy Johnson poisoned his own people. For profit, Act 3. The asset, the writer in the shadows, they needed a vessel for this narrative. They found him in a struggling, alcoholic white crime journalist named Leo Brannigan. Leo had access to pulp magazines and a flair for the dramatic. He was also vulnerable multiple DUIs. That's to bookies who were, conveniently, FBI informants. An agent approached him, not with a threat, but with an offer. Exclusive. Insider access to the real story of Harlem's underworld. Confidential FBI files. Interviews with key witnesses, actually other informants. All for a groundbreaking series of articles and later a book. Leo, smelling the Pulitzer he'd never win, took the bait. He became the unwitting scribe of the official lie. His articles dripping with salacious detail about Bumpy's ruthless rise. Meticulously omitted context, they painted Mame as a naive dupe, not a pillar of strength. They transformed his strategic, often avoided violence into cartoonish brutality. Leo's work, Harlem's Dark Emperor, became the primary source for every subsequent telling. It was fiction laundered through journalism. Act 4. The collateral damage. The community's choice of most devastating effect wasn't on Bumpy's reputation. He was beyond caring. It was on Harlem itself. The FBI's narrative created a generational rift. The old guard, those who remembered the war with Schultz, who remembered Bumpy's complex presence, fell silent. To defend any aspect of him was to risk being labeled an apologist for a dope king. The new activists, the rising Black Power movement, desperate for clean moral heroes, wholly rejected him. He was cast as part of the old, corrupt, self-destructive order. Eldridge Cleaver would mention him in speeches as an example of Negro misleadership. The Hollywood distortion. When the blaxploitation era arrived, the character of Bumpy Rhodes in Hell Up in Harlem was the final insult to screaming, vengeful caricature, stripped of all intellect and nuance, cementing the monstrous image in pop culture. The government had succeeded. They had turned a multifaceted historical figure into a one-dimensional cautionary tale. The real, dangerous lesson of Bumpy Johnson about Black economic power, autonomous community structures, and the razor's edge between criminality and capitalism was buried under a mountain of moralizing simplification. Epilogue. The ghost in the archiveso. Who was the real Bumpy Johnson? He was a man who lived in the gray space, a violent criminal and a community fixture, a ruthless businessman and a patron of the arts, a victim of a racist system and a perpetrator within his own community. He was all these things, but the story we got was a weapon, a file-stamped narrative neutralization. Successful. The true legacy of Bumpy Johnson isn't just in what he did, it's in the ghost that haunts the National Archives, the man who exists between the redacted lines of FBI memos and the contradictory whispers of Harlem's oldest residents, and the gap between the terrifying legend and the inconvenient, complicated human being. He is a reminder that history is not just written by the victors. Sometimes it is manufactured by the state with a typewriter, a tape recorder, and a lie that serves a purpose far greater than the truth.